Why don't we just kind of kick it off and I can set things up a little bit? So today we're here with Mike of Light Minds for sort of a cafe chat podcast. And the purpose of this is to have more of a casual conversation about some of the topics that are covered in the channel. And to have a little fun, Mike doesn't know what we're going to be talking about. So I'm going to spring this on him a little bit and we'll just kind of see how this goes. And what I wanted to do today is talk about social media outrage and how that relates to some of the principles in the book Resolve and some of the things that Mike talks about. And where I'm thinking of is, you think about a lot of topics that get traction on social media have sort of a daily villain sort of a feel. There's some outrage, there's something that's happening, and people just kind of pile on. And it's energizing in some ways, but also leaves us draining. And so it's this moral outrage. There's some terrible thing that's happened. You talk about it. And what I wanted to do was kind of unpack that dynamic on social media. Why is it? What's happening when we get sucked into these, flame wars, when we talk about these different things that are in the news? Because I do think it relates to the human condition and how we interact with other people. And so what I want to do first was start a little bit about the ego and the survival mechanism. And maybe, Mike, you could talk a little bit about, how does the ego work? How do you perceive danger? What is the difference between how early man's brain worked and, maybe kind of the reasons for people to have an ego and, what purpose did that serve back then?
Okay. First, let me just say thanks for everyone who's showing up to this live stream. And feel free to put a comment in. If you want to put a comment in on anything that we're talking about, we will do our best to address it. So the question was, what is the ego? So the ego is part of the survival mechanism of the body. So the ego is created by the mind, and the mind is, from the brain, which is part of the survival mechanism of the body. So the purpose of these whole, biological surviving mechanisms is to survive and thrive. The brain helps the body to do that. One of the things is it creates an ego. And so the ego's purpose is sort of twofold. It's constantly looking around to make sure that whatever the body's coming into contact with helps it to either survive or thrive or not. So it's always making some kind of judgment or decision if this is a good idea or not, to be around this person, to purchase this thing, to look at this thing, to interact with this thing. So it has a very survivalist function, which is very, very important for the human body, obviously. And it also, I should say, that the ego is your personality. It's what you use to interact with other human bodies, right? And so so that's one of the things the ego does. Another thing that the ego does is this. It holds on to any kind of unresolved emotions, trauma, even difficult, challenging emotions it doesn't know how to resolve. And it just sort of holds on to it. As it does so, and the human body grows, that can actually add to a strong sense of anxiety or even depression or anger in that ego. And so, because it's holding on to all these unresolved energies. And so, over time, the ego will also then begin to just really be really invested in the outcome, get really anxious in the outcome, or really try to reject something and push away. So, it's doing its normal function, but with such a strong sense of emotion attached to it because it's held on to all these trauma energies, maybe even that it's inherited from generational trauma or unresolved emotional experiences from the past. So that's a longer explanation of what an ego is, but that's it.
Yeah, here's how I would think about it is that the ego is sort of what interprets the world around you and then, gives you the information you need to know. And in ancient man, it's like survival. There's a saber-toothed tiger, there's some threat, so some things bad, other things are good. Food is good, shelter is good, warmth is good, whatever. And so that's kind of how the lizard brain handles that information. It processes and gives you what you need to know. And this still exists today. Our brain still has these aspects. Like we are still operating with that lizard brain. It's
Yeah.
just that we don't have saber-toothed tigers, you know, we don't have those same threats to us. The threats are different. The threat is being cast out of the tribe. If you're no longer part of the group, your chance of survival is much lower now. So we're very attuned to how other people are responding to us. Are we accepted by the group? Do we get the group's approval, et cetera? That is basically survival, you know, to our lizard
Yes.
brain.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
so this is
Human bodies survive better in community. I think that's sort of a known studied fact that they survive better in community with each other. Right.
right. Okay, so that's sort of how the ego's kind of like that's its purpose. It serves a useful purpose, but now in modern times, the threats that we face are actually very different, but the brain still works in a certain way, or the ego works in a certain way. Yeah.
Hmm.
Now, I think the next thing then after that is, okay, what does ego do if you're under threat? It wants you to take action. So it perceives things around you, and then it spurs you as a body to do something, you know, to get the food, to protect the body, to procreate, pass your genes on, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think in the book you talk about empowering emotions, things that, you know, you feel because then it spurs you to take action. So the ego is trying to get you to take some action. Can you explain that a little bit more? Like what is the ego doing there?
Yeah. So, and when I work with people, and there's usually some kind of recurring problem in which there's always an unwanted outcome. The coaching around here, the philosophies of it is all about the emotions and resolving the emotions. So when I ask the person, what emotions do you want to resolve? They always say one of two, anxiety or fear or frustration and anger. And what I tell them is anxiety and anger are very empowering emotions, meaning there are actually emotions driving the anxiety or the anger underneath that. And so that I tell them the anxiety is fearing something, anxiety is fear, and the fear is fearing something. Anger is a very protective emotion and it's protecting you from something. What are they fearing or protecting you from? What the mind feels is it's a worse emotion, a more dangerous emotion underneath that, like guilt, shame, self-loathing, unresolved emotional pain that it doesn't know how to resolve. And so when I say it's an empowering emotion, I mean the mind will actually keep a person on that topic, say around like dealing with my mother or dealing with my boss. It'll keep you on this level of just feeling anger or anxiety all the time because it wants you to move. And I say it's empowering emotions. When you feel anger, adrenaline pumps through you. Even some endorphins pump through you. And so the body gets up and tries to resolve the problem. It's active. It's very, really, really active in anger or anxiety to solve problems. And it will keep you there on that topic for years, decades even, in the hope that that body will solve the problem. It doesn't want you to drop underneath to feelings or emotions that it feels is more dangerous for the systems to survive, like guilt, shame, self-loathing, things like that. So that's what I mean by empowering emotion. It keeps you in this active, trying to solve the problem state.
Yeah, so maybe in social media, you're talking about how things can create anger or anxiety. So you see something online, you're pissed off, like there's an injustice, there's something that's so ridiculous, etc. And then you feel good dunking on the other side, or you feel, you know, a sense of camaraderie or community when you're banding with other people who also think it's ridiculous or unfair or whatever it might be. So that's actually a natural and probably understandable feeling. Like you want to feel that sense of community with other people. And then your action to address that emotion, that anger or anxiety is to, you know, send a tweet or post something, et cetera. So it's spurring you to take action. And this is actually what social media companies want. They want you to be engaged on the platform. They want you to reply. They want you to get, you know, engaged in the content. But when you think about it, and in some ways, you know, that sense of community is also it's contagious. It's you know that's why it's viral. You know, things appeal to other people. You feel a sense of you know closeness, community, et cetera, and then you feel like you're part of the tribe. You feel protected. You feel safe. And maybe deep down inside, what you're saying is there's something beneath that. You know, you don't actually know these people that are being dunked on. You don't actually have any actual first person relationship with that particular issue. But what you do care about is being part of the group, being part of the tribe, being accepted, you know. And that might indicate that there's some deeper emotion of feeling the need to be part of the group, the need to feel safe, the need to feel acknowledged or to have your pain, acknowledged. And so there's some deeper emotion, beneath the surface that social media
Yeah.
is exploiting. Can you talk about that? Like what are those deep emotions? You touched upon it in your last answer, but maybe you can get more into that and then talk about how these surface emotions are not actually what's going on. It's really what's deeper, that's
Hmm.
the reason why people are reacting this way.
Hmm. So first, let me say that social media platforms, that we're all aware of, Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, things like that, Facebook, they are all aware of the business that they're in. And, they're in the business, and two, they're all aware of the business that they're in, meaning they know what they need to do in order for that business to grow and thrive, which is basically increase the amount of time that people are on it and socially interacting. What can happen a lot is, like I said, the mind wants you to keep you in this sense of anger. And they are learning now that a person can get addicted to anger. So anger, because it's releasing certain kind of neurochemical emotions. Emotions are all neurochemicals in there. Every emotion that you have is made up of neurochemicals. And if the body is actually used to staying in a certain kind of emotion a lot, anxiety, anger, actually the brain gets used to a certain kind of stasis of I need these certain kinds of neurochemicals to remain in what it feels is a stasis. So if it's anger, it's anger. Adrenaline is released, endorphins are released, you feel a rush. Anger is actually, and anxiety is actually pretty close to excitement. It's just interpreted by the mind as being angry about something. So in that respect, what can happen a lot in social media is, and happened here, is the body got addicted to the anger and got addicted to all the neurochemicals that the anger was releasing, but it never got past that part of it. It didn't necessarily here point to something that needed to be taken care of underneath, or at least the mind didn't end up saying, I wonder if the anger that I'm always feeling on social media is pointing to a deeper emotion underneath that needs to be resolved. It just sort of stayed in the anger because it got addicted to it.
So then that's interesting because as we're on social media and we're posting and we're getting involved in these conversations and it's feeding our anger, there are some tools that we can use then to kind of break that cycle to figure out what's actually going on. So if you just pause and say, hey, like, why am I getting worked up about this? Like, what difference does that make? It's like meditation, where if you just take a step back, then you might have a different perspective on what's actually really happening. And I think that's a little bit of what your methodology does is to get to actually what is going on deeper inside. Can you talk a
Hmm.
little bit about, how might you apply that principle to things like social media or situations in real life where you get worked up about something, but that's not actually the issue. That's the surface emotion. What's really happening is something deeper. How do you get that realization of what that deeper emotion is? And then what do you do about it?
Well, so understand that the human body is a survival mechanism, and if it's actually doing things intuitively for its own survival in the background, whether honestly the person is aware of it or not. So when you mentioned the person then goes on social media to find communities to connect with, so like I said, anger is a protective emotion. It's protecting you from feeling more difficult emotions like emotional pain of disconnection or feeling threatened by a group of people. And so you said that people on social media, yes, they'll type angry comments in here, but then they'll also go to another social media group where they find a sense of community. And that will help to resolve that feeling underneath, less of a threat when there are people there that think like me, have similar views on politics, the economy, religion, things like that. And so the body's actually, you said that, you do these social media platforms, put angry comments here, but then we go to another group where we're feeling a sense of community over here. And that is the body intuitively trying to deal with this situation of always feeling under threat. Sometimes people come to me though when, you know, years and years, sometimes decades later, they're realizing like they're feeling depressed, they're feeling angry all the time and anxious all the time because now there's possibly consequences to this. So anything that can become addictive, addiction to me is you do this thing so much to the point where other important aspects of your life are negatively affected. And so when that starts to happen, maybe you're not getting good along with your relatives now, maybe because you're angry so much, you're losing friends, you're losing relationships with relatives, you get depressed, and then you might start to realize like there's something underneath here that I need to address.
Yeah. And so I think that of these kinds of social media, to me, having these kinds of conversations that are constructive, that form a sense of community where, people can learn from each other, it's kind of a form of, in my opinion, form of counter programming. Yes, social media companies are trying to get you outraged, try to hook you with these, emotions so you spend more time on the platform. And what I think we'd like to do is kind of break the outrage cycle and just have an honest conversation about things that actually matter. And there is an audience for this kind of content. It might be small, but people who care about what's really going on, and are trying to figure things out for themselves, we'd like to have a community that can support those people. Whatever your issue is, whatever's happening, if you realize some of these things and use the ideas from the book and the protocols that are described, you have a deeper understanding of what's actually happening, and that can be really helpful. And once you have a community of other people that you can talk to about these things, you can learn from each other, you can support each other. And I think that's the kind of environment that ultimately we'd like to create.
Well, it is definitely a way to expand your social circle. And so when I was a drug counselor, there were definitely people who used social media and being on their phones, you could say as a distraction, but also they had strong anxiety and anger problems. So, for instance, I worked with a young man in which he said, being on the phone actually helps to relax me. And I initially doubted it because he was in a counseling session and I was checking to see if we were able to interact, and he was. And I realized it is relaxing him. Without the phone, without it, he was actually getting really, really anxious. And he had, I looked at his chart. He had diagnosed anxiety. He had certain genetically inherited, neurophysiological conditions like ADHD, things like that. So it wasn't just him getting so hyped up on the phone and stuff like that. It was doing something to relax him. I mean, yes, you could say it was being used like a drug, but certain people, they get relaxed on their phones. It helps them to feel socially connected. It relaxes them. And I noticed that it wasn't really affecting our conversations, actually. He was able to talk to me fine. He was just sort of looking at his phone while he was doing it. So let me just first say that. And I am on my phone a lot too. So some people here are already commenting here, it's not a problem till it's a problem. We need it. I'm doing these kinds of connections with people. So I think that social media and the communities that are generated over here, there's so many, hundreds of thousands of them, that you can move from communities in which it just exploits social outrage all the way to communities where you feel really, really connected. And so it's doing both together. So you could sort of say it is like, these social media platforms are, they know what business they're in. They're just trying to feed their business. But in doing so, they're allowing a whole range of connections with people from being angry about something to connecting with something. And it's really up to the intuition of that particular body to move from one to the other or back and forth between the two.
Yeah, so maybe this is a good place to kind of wrap up is to, open up the discussion to other topics, whatever people are interested in, we'd be happy to, in future episodes, talk about those things. Other things, Mike, that you want to talk about for the future that we might cover, just to give people a sense of the kind of content that might be here.
Well, as I'm looking on as I'm looking on the comments right now, a lot of people just sort of joined in the last like 15, 20 minutes. Actually, would you mind talking about this a little bit more? Is that okay?
Yeah, sure. We can talk about it more without repeating the things that we've already talked about. The
Yeah,
basic,
let's just keep on going because I noticed
yeah,
that people were joining in the conversation in the last 20 minutes. So,
yeah. The basic idea that we started with was that social media creates outrage. That social media, the business model is to keep people on the platform as long as possible so you can sell more ads. And one of the ways of doing that is stirring up emotions, especially anger, where people get all riled up about something, and then it feeds into our desire to be part of a community, to be part of the tribe. It's part of a survival instinct to be with other like-minded people for safety, for security, for camaraderie, for community. And so this is what social media does. It can be used for good, where you actually find people who support you, understand what you're going through, and can really help you. But it also can be used in ways that, manipulate your emotions in an unhelpful way. And so I think
Hmm.
that's what we're trying to say is, okay, we want this to be a space where people can talk about things or to explore these emotions so they get down, beneath the surface. What is really going on? It's my fear of losing a job. It's my fear of, losing my loved one. I don't, or some people are lost in some way and, they need that help. There's something deep inside that's really bothering them or they're worried about, they're fearful of, or whatever it might be,
Yeah.
and just trying to like have a space where they can understand that's what's going on. Once they have that
Hmm.
realization, that can be helpful because now there's something they can actually do about it.
Yeah. So this relates to, so a lot of what the coaching that I do, I work with parents or families in which they're dealing with addiction and behavioral issues in their home. And when they ask about how do we, help our loved ones to turn the corner, how do we get them to do more healthy things? They're so stuck on this thing that they're feeling self-righteously angry. They're using drugs. Their emotions are way out of control. And honestly, what I tell them is, as long as we're able to help them to maintain a certain kind of stasis of safety, helping that system to survive, eventually what happens is the consequences, the consequential buildup of all of these difficult emotions leads to a turn in which that person goes, I'm just tired of feeling this way. They have a turn of heart. And but what I tell them is you have to let the consequences build up. It's not just one consequence that does it. So in a way, we're talking about it's a bad thing, you could say. But on the other hand, what I tell them is it's the consequences. It's constantly feeling this over and over and over again that eventually causes the entire, bodily body mind system to go, enough. I don't want to do this anymore. And therefore, there can be a change. So without the buildup of this, you can say negativity, sometimes the consequence isn't reached.
Yeah,
And
can you
so,
give some examples? Because, for people who don't know, what are some examples of the clients or people you've worked with in the past? What were the consequences? What was the buildup? What caused them to reach that point where they said, enough's enough, I need to do something?
well, it's when I say the consequences, I meant the emotional consequences. Yes, there was fights in the family. Yes, there was arrests. Yes, there was, like cops being called to the house sometimes. When I say consequences, I mean the emotional consequences. Feeling distraught all the time. That's stress. Cortisol is released. Constantly feeling that all the time eventually can lead to a change where the system, that feeling of the consequences and the distraughtness peaks, and then the person could be take years now, says, I don't want to do this anymore. And they just start to look for ways to spiritually, emotionally relax. And that's where some of this work can come in. So, you know, I could say that here, being on social media, especially responding to things like politics online, there was definitely a strong sense of distraughtness several years ago in which there was just anger and fear, and that's it. It just stayed there, right? But over the course of time in doing these kind of coaching protocols that we use in this account, and that happened here first, the emotions actually peaked and went down. So the difference now is it's very well possible that I can go on social media into a total political discussion and type things in there and, vent a particular side and stuff. The difference is, though, the intensity of the emotions underneath is like 70 to 80% less. And I'll be honest, when that happens, it's almost seemed like fun. So a lot of people on social media, when they're commenting, especially on things like politics and religion and what's wrong with society, it's not necessarily fun. They're like addicted to their anger and they just get flustered all the time. They just keep on feeding it. When you do this work and the difficult, even traumatic emotions underneath all that anger is resolved, you can go back to that and have these kinds of discussions, even take a side and look like you're arguing and all, but deep inside your heart, you're calm. And so I've even had discussions like this live in a restaurant with somebody, with a friend, in which we're disagreeing over something political. And honestly, other friends looking, going, okay, you guys are getting upset. But honestly, what I'm saying, what I answer is, no, I'm actually having fun. Because it feels like fun inside. Because there's less of a sense of a person feeling threatened here after doing the work of the protocols in this account.
Yeah, so you're saying in the past you got triggered, you were threatened, you felt anxiety or whatever it is, but after doing the work, you were much more at peace, you were much more comfortable with yourself, you didn't have those deep emotions that were stirred up, and therefore you're able to, handle things more peacefully. Is that the basic idea?
Yes. And
Yeah.
so, I mean, so what I'm saying is, though, those kinds of consequences needed to build up. They needed to build up to peak. Like I'm looking at somebody's comment in here talking about their partner with the emotional outbursts and stuff. So those emotional outbursts are pointing to deeper emotions underneath that need to be resolved. Unresolved emotional pain, self-loathing, unresolved grief. There's like 5 core emotions that we talk about in the coaching protocols of this account, of this channel, that are underneath the anger. And that's what happened here. The consequences kept on building up, the distraughtness kept on building up. Social media was adding to that, arguments are adding to that until it peaked. And it was allowed to peak. The emotions underneath were resolved. And then the entire ego up to that point was like, honestly, an angry, reactive, self-righteous ego that was constantly feeling like it had the right to talk to people in a certain way because it felt threatened and it felt it was in the right. And in doing so, I lost a marriage. I've also heard of people like losing relationships with their children as a result of this. But what happened here was, through the coaching protocols here that were done on me first, all of that pent up, unresolved trauma and emotional energy was allowed to peak, be integrated into the system. It wasn't pushed away. It wasn't chopped out. It wasn't gotten rid of. It wasn't seen as the bad guy. It was integrated and resolved like a wave going back into the ocean. And then it was seen that the ego was much more relaxed. It was more like you could say thinned out. It can have discussions, but it wasn't now in this kind of really intense, you're threatening me and I got to win this argument. And so then arguments, even on the political vein, become more relaxed and even honestly fun. Yeah.
Yeah, so but when the commenter was saying that they're in this relationship, their partner has these really emotional outbursts or things like that. It seems like what you need is the partner to have the kind of realizations and understanding that you had. Is that what you're saying, or are you saying something
Yeah, it
different?
does seem like if the emotional outbursts are continuing and getting into still a very self-destructive thing, and they're talking about alcohol here. And
Yeah.
so if they continue in this self-destructive vein like it was here, and I'm a recovering alcoholic, and so that was being done here as well. Eventually, yeah, I mean that's pointing to the pain underneath and stuff. So when I honestly when I work with the parents of people like that, and they're like, well, how do we get them to get there? Because they don't want to listen to me. To a certain degree, you have to let them experience the consequences. Now, the difficulty is people who have multiple addiction issues usually have multiple mental health issues, meaning that they are in a state of anxiety and frustration all the time. And their baseline level of it is much higher than an average person. So even though I tell them you have to let them suffer the consequences, people like us, born into these generational trauma resolving bodies, can take a lot of suffering compared to the average and
Yeah.
stuff.
But in this situation, the person is drinking, and they're drinking as a form of self-medication. There's some pain that they're trying to repress or dull or mitigate. And that's the reason for them to drink, right?
Yeah.
And so then
But
what is your suggestion in that situation? Like
I'm
what can
glad you
actually
said
be done?
that. Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
glad you said that. So people like that, including me, we were trying to live a life like everybody else, but the bodies were just too emotionally sensitive. And so I drank to get to the same point of emotional resolution that I am now. So when I would drink, things wouldn't get to you so much. You can actually, you had problems, but the body was more relaxed about it. Unfortunately, the alcohol is like a poison. It ate away the lining of my stomach and stuff, but I was the consequence that I needed to stop drinking, to tell you the truth. So, but then after the emotions were resolved naturally in what we call the peaceful presence of universal energy, now I can have these conversations. And it's actually very similar to when I was drinking because I can have the discussions. It can even be a disagreement, but I can feel good inside. I felt grounded. I didn't feel as threatened at all. Actually, I felt no sense of a threat. I can talk to friends, I could talk to people, and there's just not as much of a sense of a threat there. And that's what the alcohol was doing. Now it's just done without the alcohol. So the alcohol was pointing to what the body wanted, but it was just doing it in a self-destructive way. It was really pointing to you really need to get to that point by resolving the emotions underneath that. Then you'll be able to act the way you want to act, but without needing the alcohol or the drugs to do that.
Yeah. So an individual has some deep emotion, something that they're self-medicating, they're trying to avoid the pain or whatever the issue is. If there's some other way to resolve that core emotion, to dissipate that, then they wouldn't have to drink to dull the pain. They wouldn't have to self-medicate. There'd be another way of achieving kind of what they
Yeah.
ultimately want or need. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's what I've heard also. So when I've done this protocol with other people, they report the same things. So, of course, parents in relationship to their adult children who are addicted, they have multiple mental health issues. There used to be a lot of emotionally sensitive reaction and fighting and stuff like that. So the adult child would yell at them, they would get triggered and yell right back, right? So they then went through this protocol in which, in the peaceful presence of universal energy as a cushion, the emotions allowed to peak and get integrated into the system. Another important thing is you don't go into the mind. It's all emotional energy based. And then they report, now my son, daughter is having the same kind of, or even the problem gets worse. The child walks out of treatment, they move out of the house, they get into a really bad argument, but they then report when they go through this process in which the emotions allowed to peak and get integrated, it's amazing. I'm relaxed. I'm not reacting the same way. It's not hitting me the same way. I don't feel as heavy in there and it's threatened. It's just calmer inside, even though they're doing the same exact thing that they were doing before that would get me upset. It's why? It's because we resolve the emotions underneath. Yeah.
Okay, there was a lot there. Let's like slow that down a little bit and then explain a little bit more. So there's a situation where someone, maybe a client of yours, is saying that their loved one, maybe their, let's say, child in this example, has an addiction, addicted to alcohol, addicted to drugs, whatever it might be. And when the parent would try to help the child, that would trigger an argument, where the child would push back, they would trigger each other, and there would be kind of a not a healthy interaction there. And so what you were saying was that through the protocol, which was on the parent, not the child in this case, it was letting the parent understand, hey, this is the emotion that's coming in within you. Yes, I want to help you want to help your child. You don't want them to suffer from this addiction, blah, blah, blah. But you also are are triggering your loved one, your child. You are saying things that
Yeah,
are
in a
making the
way,
situation worse.
they are just as addicted to as their child to a certain kind of behavior. Yes, the adult child is doing something that's destructive, but the parent or the family member, because I also work with wives, husbands, partners of people who have the addiction issues as well, but 90% of them I would say are parents. They're addicted to controlling them. And so when you say they were trying to help, had to help them clear up a certain kind of agenda. Even though they're saying help, what's really happening is they're getting really nervous. They have unresolved anxiety in there, understandably, because they've seen their child maybe overdose. They've seen their child maybe, go to jail or just have tumultuous fights in the house. So they're actually saying, I'm trying to help and trying to direct the child towards something, but it's really also because there's an unresolved emotion in here that they're trying to calm themselves from.
Yeah,
They're trying to calm themselves down.
let's talk about that. So the parent's core emotion may be fear that their child is hospitalized, loses their job, or God forbid, dies. It could also be shame or guilt that they didn't do something they should have, or they allowed something to happen that they shouldn't have allowed, or whatever it might be. But that parent in that situation could have some very deep-seated emotions of their own that they have never really dealt with. And dealing with that first will enable them to help their child or their addicted loved one. Is that
Yes.
right?
Yes. Very true. Yes. And let's just, I mean, somebody just put a comment in here. What if the roles were reversed, like the parent has the addiction? Well, whoever has the addiction in there, it's possible for both to have the addiction. I've definitely heard of things where the child is, they're getting into arguments with their parent because the parent's mad that they're using heroin, but then the parent is drinking. And so I've seen words like both together like that. Um, but I think this commenter is saying that what if the roles were reversed, like the parent has the addiction? You're in the same spot, possibly. So it is really difficult when there's addiction and mental health and behavioral issues in the family because it brings up all kinds of unresolved emotions inside just dealing with that person and stuff. So what I told them is to do your best to be on your end agendaless. That way, what needs to happen for that person to heal and get better will happen more intuitively. Because I say what actually makes the person with the addiction stop, like I said before, is the consequences. The consequences, and when I say consequences, the emotional consequences, the upsetness, the distraughtness, the despair. And I should also say one more thing is that we're talking about addictions and alcoholism right now, but the same thing can happen in social media. You get addicted to the distraughtness of it, and there's an emotion underneath that it's pointing to that can be resolved there. But until that happens, you'll stay addicted to this behavior, staying on social media and being addicted to your phone, just like a person could be addicted to alcohol.
Yeah, so, something you said that I wanted to maybe explore a little bit more was that experiential feeling of the emotion as opposed to the cognitive, rational understanding of it. One of the things that I think we often talk about is, well, you shouldn't do this. It's not good for your health. It's not good for your blah, blah, blah. You're going to
Yeah.
blah, blah, blah. There's a lot of rationalization, of why you should or shouldn't do something. But that doesn't really address the issue. The core issue is some deep emotional fear or self-loathing or whatever it might be, that it's very difficult to use some cognitive arguments, some rational arguments to change someone's behavior. It's really much
Well,
more of a deep, deep feeling.
I would say if the cognitive argument worked, fine. When I work with people, honestly, I'll try to use cognitive coaching. And if it works, and I see definitely sense that there's an emotional shift towards something that's more stabilizing for the system, fine, I won't even go into the protocol. It's when those cognitive, rational arguments don't work. Drugs are bad for you. Look what it's doing to you. You're causing all these problems. The person on the other side may be very, very aware of that. So what I tell the parent or the person dealing with this is, when you're using those kinds of informational, educational arguments like that, all of those attempts, if it's not working on the outset, all of those attempts are bound to fail. Why? Because it's lacking something. When you're trying to educate somebody like that, what that's lacking is the direct experience of the consequence of that behavior.
Yeah.
And until you have that there for that person, it's definitely addicted. Now, the addiction is masking the problem as well. It's hard to get to that consequence when they're drinking. It's hard to get to the consequence when they're using drugs. But that's the idea, though, is, uh, they have to get to the consequence of that, and that's why all of these rational arguments fail.
Yeah. As a drug counselor, you would see people who had hit rock bottom and they were desperate. They needed, they realized that they had to make a change. They couldn't continue. The consequence had piled up to the point that they
Yeah.
really wanted to change things.
Now, yeah, and you said a term there that is really unpopular in addiction recovery circles. People like don't, and definitely parents don't want to hear, I do not want to wait for my child to hit rock bottom. I keep on hearing this rock bottom thing. I don't want them to lose everything and stuff. So let me say that rock bottom when it comes to addiction is a personal thing. One person's rock bottom is totally different than another. So I work with a mother in which she was working with me, and I asked her, what made you change? Her rock bottom was simply her 7-year-old child saying, Mom, are you okay? You look like you're on, you look like you're high. And that was her rock bottom. She got so nervous about that, like, oh my goodness, my 7-year-old child is noticing this. She stopped right on the spot and began going into recovery. But I've also met another mother in which the rock bottom was a little bit more. I mean, she had to lose her children. So rock bottom is just a term, but what's rock bottom for people is totally different. But when that happens, Yes, that is when the consequences of what they're doing get so bad that the system itself, when I say the consequences, the distraughtness, the fear, the emotional turmoil inside gets so bad that there's a change.
Yeah. And that's what your protocol tries to help people is when they're at that point where they're open to that, then you can help them understand what's really going on.
Yeah. So from the point of view of the person, I know that we started on this on social media, but say you see your child is addicted to social media, and you can see that's maybe affecting their mood in a really negative way and stuff. And you try to throw all these facts at them, like here's what it's doing, read this article, read that article, it's not stopping. And the more you try to discuss this with them, the more they're getting into fights. Now they're getting more defensive and holding onto their phone even more as a result of this. One, you sort of have to realize what the social media and the phone is actually doing. It's very well possible that that person has an anxiety issue. They possibly have a genetically inherited neurophysiological condition in which their neurochemicals just constantly are much more depressed and anxious than everybody else in their neurochemical balance. Therefore, the phone is acting like a drug, a medication to stabilize them and stuff. So you trying to take away that phone and trying to give all these reasons why they shouldn't do it, if you're not understanding the problem deep inside and helping them to do other things, exercise, diet, sleep, exercise, meditation, spirituality, all these other things, and it's going to fail and stuff. So now this is very similar to being a person being addicted to alcohol, right? And so the parent, though, it's hard for them to see this. So what they say, well, what do I do? You got to let them experience the consequence. In order to let them experience the consequence of what they're doing, you actually have to feel comfortable watching them like this. You have to feel comfortable watching them get distraught. And that's where the parent's agenda comes in. I say, you will not be able to feel comfortable watching them like this unless you have resolved your own emotions.
Yeah. And I wanted to call back to something that was said earlier for people who might have joined late is that social media is not, good or bad. It's not black and white. There are a lot of positive, communities and social media ability to share experiences and bond with others. So as you had mentioned earlier, this is on a continuum. And so what we're trying to do is get people more on the positive, constructive, community where people have a sense of safety and belonging you know so we don't want to we're not trying to say that social media is inherently evil or anything like that.
No, not at all. And I also want to say, like, again, this is all about resolving those core emotions underneath. Any kind of addictive problem that always leads to a sense in the end of distraughtness, anxiety, depression, frustration that just gets unresolved. All it's pointing to is there's an emotion underneath that needs to be resolved. Because when you resolve that, like I said, you can go back to social media. I wouldn't suggest you go back to drinking, but you can go back to social media and these kinds of political arguments and stuff like that, and you find that, wow, now it's sort of seen like a ride, like an amusement ride. It's sort of seen like fun. It's entertaining. It's not seen as this titanic fight between good and evil, and I'm feeling threatened because you people are doing this, and I have to like keep on texting and stuff like that. You can go back into it, but your ego is now much more relaxed naturally because all the emotions that it was holding on to, that all that anger was pointing to, got resolved. And now you can go on to this stuff and even take part in a disagreement, and you're feeling fine in the end.
That's great. Anything else from the comments we want to address before we wrap?
Um, I mean, we definitely touched on issues of addiction and behavioral health that we can do in another discussion. I think that would be really, really helpful because issues of the ego and its purpose and function in the human body and how it can become an out of control ego that's contributing to issues that that person's having is definitely like addiction is exemplary of that. And so we can do that on another discussion. But to sort of wrap up this conversation is, and I'm glad we went into addiction though, because definitely being on social media, this whole discussion started about social media and the outrage. It can definitely become one of those things that's addicting, that it keeps on bringing up these feelings of anger, which is also adrenaline and endorphins. You can get addicted to that. But like any addiction and the distraughtness of it, it's pointing to core emotions underneath self-loathing, guilt, shame, unresolved pain, unresolved grief, loss, or just primal fear of survival. That when you resolve those core emotions underneath, with social media, again, I would not suggest going back to drugs. With things like social media, you can possibly go back to it and be entertained by it. It can be used in a much more relaxed way, and you can even have fun with these discussions in which there's disagreements, and you'll find almost miraculously, I'm not as upset inside. I'm not feeling as threatened inside. This is actually sort of fun. And I've talked to people who this has happened to. I'm actually sort of having fun having this disagreement with this person. And then when the disagreement's over, you're not feeling as heavy. It can just be dropped and you just go about your day. And really, there's no problem with it. Whereas in the past, when your ego is heavier, full of these unresolved emotions, it's like, I never want to talk to that person. Now my day is ruined. Now it's just like, just go about your day and just seen as just a regular part of your day, having this up and down. You can even enjoy the ride of your emotions.
Great. Sounds good. Well, why don't we wrap it there for today?
Okay. Thank you. And I want to thank everyone for participating in this. I really appreciate it. And we hope to do more of these kinds of podcasts, cafe chat-like discussions in the future, every Sunday at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time. So thank you, everyone, for participating.